We do have a ton to get through in this episode.
Common sense is finally prevailing.
There was controversy this month, Dave.
I'm not particularly excited by that.
Secrets and things on set.
I haven't told them anything.
I think this is just good times all round.
Every Doctor Who is liked by somebody, and that's a really good thing.
Davo, my doctor.
I know we disagree on this one.
First world problems, Dave.
I get why fans are asking those questions.
Oh gosh, that's actually quite a lot to talk about.
It doesn't compute.
It's the elephant in the room.
That's okay.
Fandom versus the BBC.
The cardinal sin.
Moving along.
Lunch.
G'day, I'm Rob.
And I'm Dave.
And tonight we'll be discussing Doctor Who Season 24 as voted by you out there. Dave, hello. How's your month been?
My month hasn't been too bad, actually, Rob. It's been busy at work, but look, spring has sprung here. It's pleasant. It's not too hot. It's not too cold. It's been a good month, and I'm actually looking forward. I'm really looking forward to talking about Season 24. I have many things to say, and it's fair to say this won by quite a margin in the end. I think our listeners are keen as well.
Yeah, I think so. There's an appetite for the early Sylvester stuff. That's for sure. 40% of the vote, I think it took out in the end.
Which isn't bad in a four-way poll.
I know.
It was over a 10% margin. It beat Pertwee's option by, so definitely some love and or curiosity there.
Yeah, absolutely. And Dave, I've recently, in the last 24 hours, heard you outside of this podcast talking on another podcast. Do you want to talk about that?
Thank you, Rob. I'm glad you listened. I was very happy to be invited by friend of the podcast and occasional fill-in host of the podcast, Dylan Rees, onto his Too Hot for TV podcast, where he talks about a whole bunch of Doctor Who that isn't the TV show. And you were on this a few years ago, Rob, talking about coffee table books, I believe.
Oh, I've been on twice on his show, yeah.
Well, what was the second one?
The second one was around the time of the anniversary last year, and I looked at some alternate anniversary type stories.
That's right, you did too. Well, you've been on twice. I've been invited on for the first time this month, and it was lots of fun. Very intimidating because he has lots of very funny guests on, and I wasn't sure I could live up to the standard, but I was invited on. I did get to talk about the Radio Times 20th anniversary special magazine, which has the distinction of being the first piece of Doctor Who merchandise my dad bought for me rather than buying for him. Way back in the day. And I also got the distinction of being the first guest to talk about a Virgin missing adventure. A few people have talked about the new adventures, and I said, look, I'll be very keen to talk about a new adventure. And Dylan said, well, actually, no one's ever done a missing adventure. Let's do one of those. So we picked between us the David McGinty Davo missing adventure, Lords of the Storm. So that is out now. It was lots of fun. Dylan said there that he's very keen to do something with all three of us sometime, and we have got an idea, Rob, I think, between us of what that will be. But we'll wait until we actually record it before we say anything, because getting together with three people is always complicated. But look, that was really good. Please check out Doctor Who Too Hot for TV with my guest appearance.
Yes, you even got to be a bit sweary on there.
It's funny, isn't it? Because obviously on our podcast, on indeed most podcasts, they don't want to get the explicit rating, so you have to be very careful not to swear, or you know, if you do, it's because you really want to make a point, and I know that I'm giving you the task of then having to add a little bleep on there and make your life a little bit more complicated. But Dylan doesn't have that requirement, and I realised listening back just how much I do naturally swear, and very conversationally as well, which is probably a combination of being, at an old boys' school in the Air Force, and also I think just being Australian. Yeah.
You got loose, but it was good.
Yeah,
I liked it.
Yes, I'm not surprised you noticed that, because I noticed that listening back as well. Speaking of other podcasts as well, just a final plug this month for our friends at Sirens of Audio, who are, of course, running events in Australia. The next round is the Sylvester McCoy Janet Fielding set of events, which kick off in Melbourne on the 10th of November. So if you are in Melbourne or any other Australian city, please check out the Sirens of Audio website and come along to those events if you can. They are good fan-run events. You get proper time with the guests. They're affordable. There's a good crowd. I've been to all ones in Melbourne and one of the ones in Sydney. So, yeah, check them out.
Lovely. And Dave, finally, we should just plug our own podcast too, because we've recently put out a Jin and TARDIS episode and a Listmakers episode.
Yes, we are very prolific as always. The Gin and TARDIS episode was on the Gunfighters, where a lot of gin was consumed as we got through that one. Look, it was good. We had a good laugh. We saw some really good points. We saw some weaker points. That's probably the favourite Gin and TARDIS I think we've done so far, certainly for me.
Oh, that's good. And one thing I'll add about that one is the special version of the Ballad of the Last Chance Saloon that I cooked up for the closing titles. And I even dropped it on YouTube as its own little video. So if you've only ever heard the Western version on the show with its 47 verses or whatever it is, do try my version where I pared down the lyrics to a more pop song sort of structure. And then imagine it done by, I don't know, Bananarama circa 1986. And you might change your mind about the song.
I think, Rob, you initially pitched it to me as the Ballad of the OK Corral as sung by the Pet Shop Boys.
Yes, well, that was where it was beginning. An electropop version, there was a male vocal, but it morphed into a female sort of thing.
Right.
So,
okay. Anyway, yeah. Look, that was very fun to do. We have had a poll for which Davo's story we're going to do, and it turned out that we couldn't decide on a four-parter, so we're doing both the Awakening and the King's Demons next time, and that will either be next or, depending when the season 25 Blu-ray set lands in Australia, we may do a story from that next. But a MCCOY story and a Davo story are both coming in the next little while from Gin and TARDIS. Nice stuff. And of course, Listmakers is out with different ways the Doctor has overthrown governments over the series. Yeah, I enjoyed that one. I mean, I enjoy all of them, but that was a slightly different one, and I think it was good. Only just out a few days ago. So listeners, lots to listen to. We've done a lot of introing here, Rob. Let's get into the news. Yeah, let's get into the news. And let's start with the controversy of the month, Dave. When Ncuti Gatwa recorded the Graham Norton show recently, the publicity team briefed the press that he would be saying on the show, quote, "We did the second series this year, the Christmas special is coming up, and we are filming our third series next year." And that made headlines. But when the show actually aired in the UK, it was edited down to this, quote, "We finished the second season earlier this year. We've got the Christmas episode coming out at Christmas. But it's been amazing." Now, this is where things get interesting. Fandom assumes that because a new season isn't green lit, and RTD has been adamant that it won't be until after the second season airs, it's simple common sense to not have a message like that going out there, that they're filming a third series next year, because perhaps they're not. Yet someone involved has fed the story into Deadline now that it wasn't the BBC censoring Ncuti, and it was just the show's editor making the quote more snappy. Now, I'm calling BS here, Dave. I think if you have the star of Doctor Who declaring the series is filming next year, you don't trim that to make the rest of the quote more snappy. I would assume the BBC did censor here, and I think it's just bizarre that it can't say, "Sorry folks, Ncuti misspoke. As you all know, we aren't greenlit for a third series yet," and just leave it at that. But there's all this cloak and dagger going on around it. It is so bizarre. Yeah, going all the way back to the Moffat era, the BBC has been slightly terrible at PR regarding the show, and indeed lots of other things as well. I mean, you know, the scandal-plagued BBC of the last 10 years. But I won't go down that rabbit hole. But yeah, look, they always try to no, this totally isn't happening. We've got pictures. Yeah, but it's not really happening. Like, they're just terrible at this sort of thing. And I haven't seen the Ncuti interview on the Graham Norton show, because it would take a lot to make me watch the Graham Norton show. But friend of the podcast, Richard, did watch it, so we didn't have to. Because he does have a fondness for Graham Norton, because he's a very big fan of Father Ted. Right. So he does have a soft spot for Graham Norton. And he said, look, more than anything, what came out of it is that Ncuti is still not so much a very young actor, although he is quite young, but he's a very new to the big stage actor. He's really only had his breakout moments in the last couple of years, and he was very clearly a little bit nervous, particularly when he's on stage with some of the other guests who were big names of stage and screen, and he's obviously was just a little bit overwhelmed, a little bit intimidated, and you know, he's probably quite a shy guy, and could well have just misspoke, got a bit confused, or not explained something properly. And I think that if the BBC had said that everybody would have appreciated that. Because there were a few stories that came out of this, like, Shooty was told that he was a bad actor by the other... Richard said, no, it's like nothing like that. There was just a lot of exchanges that clickbaity media has turned into clickbait, and I think this is one of them as well.
Yeah. Shall we move on?
Yes, so look, a fun one from me. There was an interview with Peter Capaldi about a number of things, including some new work he's doing, but he did have a couple of really interesting quotes that I think show the nature of Peter Capaldi a bit more, but also, again, just reinforce what a fan he is and what his reference points were. So I'm going to give you a couple of quotes here, Rob.
Okay.
I was watching Tom Baker talking about something, and he said that when he was Doctor Who, he would do tons and tons of publicity and stuff, because being Doctor Who was much more fun than being Tom Baker. And I would say the same probably. Being Doctor Who is far more fun than being me.
Isn't that nice?
It's such a lovely reference and such a lovely thing to say. And he then followed up by saying, certainly you're in a privileged position because you receive the affection for that character. It is a character, it's not me, and it's a delightful place to be. And I think that's really nice because there's always been this sort of feeling around Peter Capaldi that's tainted in a little way with certain sort of aspects of negativity. There's this sort of sense from people like myself who really liked him as, I really loved him as the Doctor, but did he get the best era he really deserved? Did he get the best stories he really deserved? And then there's that sort of sense of, well, he doesn't want to revisit the Doctor. He says he's not going to be in an anniversary special. He doesn't want to do Big Finish. Maybe he doesn't like the show anymore, and maybe he's got a bad vibe. And you go, no, he's just a career actor who wants to do other things. He doesn't want to go backward. He wants to go forward. And just to sort of really hear that he did love his time. He loved being the Doctor. He still loves Doctor Who. I think it was just a really, really good thing. Because, look, I love the Capaldi era. I really love Peter Capaldi. He's a really... just seems a really great guy from the 30 seconds I've met him through to every interview you see him in. Just seems a really good, level-headed guy. One of those actors who kind of reached the peak of his fame later in his career. And I remember Steve Carell talking about that once, where he said, look, I didn't become a household name until I was like 45. And so by that stage, I'd been through like paying the mortgage, not being able to pay for food, knowing who I was. And so you become famous at 45. It's like, I'm grounded. I've had the grounding. Yeah. And I think Peter Capaldi's kind of the same. Like, he's had some big roles, but, I think before the thick of it, he wasn't really a name. And so he's just a very level-headed guy that lived a very normal life as an actor and suddenly found fame later on in his career. And, I just thought this was a lovely thing and wanted to share it.
Yeah, I think he sees a certain kind of integrity in not milking that he was Doctor Who. Like, he's done it, he's very proud of it, he loves the show, but he's moved on. It's a very different attitude to basically every other Doctor.
Except for maybe Eccleston, which is further in the other extreme.
Yeah, but then you've got Eccleston, who is sort of milking it a bit, and when he came back to Big Finish, he said it was for the money. When he first came back, it was like, I got bills to pay and stuff, and Hollywood's not calling, and, so...
Their money's as good as anyone's.
Yeah, exactly. So even Eccleston, and Eccleston's popping up at conventions all the time. So, I mean, Eccleston's not going to pop up in an RTD series anytime soon, but he's certainly popping up signing autographs at, $80 a pop or whatever it is. Yeah.
Yeah. So, look, just a nice little Capaldi mention from me.
All right, let's round out the news. I've got one here. Sharon D. Clarke, there's a name we haven't said on the podcast for a few years, has said that Doctor Who missed a trick by killing off her season 11 character, Grace O'Brien. In an interview with the Radio Times magazine, Clarke said she couldn't believe her character was brought to an end. And I've got a quote here. I was like, people, you've missed a trick here. To have those different generations of women in the TARDIS was glorious. A black woman, a white woman, and a brown woman. End quote. And I think it's interesting, Dave, how you can see these things, because I said at the time that killing Grace off was a bad move, so I'm fully in step with Sharon there. But for me, it was less a symbolic thing and more from the story point of view, that I think the TARDIS crew could have been just Grace and Graham. Drop Ryan and Yaz and just have this older couple as the companions. I think that would have been a more interesting crew than what we had. Maybe just for the one season, and in the second season, Jodie transitions into having a Yaz or a Ryan and a Yaz, some younger people around. Okay, fine. There are just so many ways to do TARDIS teams, aren't there?
Look, I think that's a really interesting idea, and I would certainly have been open to it. I probably disagree with yourself and Sharon. I think that although continuing characters is important, drama and pathos does occasionally require the occasional sacrifice. And occasionally you do need to kill someone off to raise stakes, to move other characters' arcs on, and I think that was the reason for the decision. But look, it's good that she enjoyed her time on the show and would have loved to have done more of it. I'm actually reminded of something in the J&T memoirs where he talks about all these guest stars who'd want to come back, and even Don Henderson, sort of drunk at the after party of recording Delta, was like, "Oh, what if Gavrok's brother came back? I could play Gavrok's brother." And JT just saying, isn't it wonderful that all these guest stars want to come back and do sequels? So, that's a positive thing. Although I think that the repercussions for the arc of the other characters perhaps makes her being written out worth it.
Yeah, and that's fair enough too. Moving along to short topics, I'm actually bringing nothing to the table this month, Dave. I've had such a busy month. I thought there's nothing I can possibly bring of interest to the listeners, so I'm handing the floor over to you for this short topic segment.
Thank you. I've got one, probably a medium topic to talk about this time.
Right.
Because apart from, watching season 24, I haven't been to any conventions. I haven't read any other Doctor Who books since my holiday. I haven't watched any other Doctor Who apart from season 24. But I have been listening to some Big Finish. And I was reflecting as I was putting this list together, and also based on a couple of messages we exchanged a month or so ago, Rob, that it's significantly changed my both consumption and enjoyment of Big Finish. The more that I've got involved in parts of fandom that are able to give good advice on this. So our friends over at the Sirens of Audio, our friends, as we were discussing earlier, over at Too Hot for TV, who often cover Big Finish, and even just chatting to yourself, Rob, who's consumed more than I have, because as we've discussed before, when you are a non-regular, and even in my case, a very rare Big Finish consumer, and you go on the Big Finish website when it's working, and okay, there are some things you can grasp onto. You can go, oh, that's a set of adaptations of novels that I like, I can do that. Or that's an adaptation of the planned season 27, or that's an adaptation of the missing season 23, or these are the plays, stage plays being made. You go, okay, they're things I can go, that's an interesting piece of ephemera. I can download those and listen to those for a number of reasons. But when you go, I just want to listen to some adventures and just dabble in them, there's 1,000 plays out there, and you just don't know where to go. And so I find myself going, oh, it's a Doctor Who story with Colin Baker and the Crotons. How bad can that be? Buy it, listen to it. Hey, it can actually be pretty bad. Or here's a Davo, Turlo and Tegan prequel to Snake Dance and Kinder. That sounds really interesting. Oh, wow, they really didn't land that, did they? This Big Finish.
There's some highly variable stuff out there.
There is, and I suspect that the average isn't that great. As in, not bad, but like the average isn't going to blow you away. And so your probability when you just wade in of getting something that you go, wow, this is I get it now, is a little bit lower than just a random selection, if you know what I mean.
Yeah.
But having people like Phil and Dwayne, Dylan, yourself, who can say, oh, we really think you should listen to this one, or we're going to have a long chat about this, and you go, oh, that actually sounds interesting. I think I'm going to watch it, or just say to them, hey, I'm thinking of downloading one of these, what do you reckon? And they go, oh, you'll really love that one. Let's try that one. That's really made a difference. And so all of these ones are ones that, have come out of that. And it's just been very positive, I think, to sort of have those exchanges and be able to enjoy Big Finish more and therefore listen to it a bit more. So the first of them is Operation Werewolf, which was plugged by Fraser Hines at the Sirens of Audio Fraser Hines Day. And it's an adaptation of the draft story outline by Douglas Campfield that was submitted way, way back at the end of the 60s as a season 6 story. So I've gone, okay, that sounds really interesting. And then you hear Fraser talking about what he did on it. You go, oh, that sounds pretty cool. And then Phil and Dwayne say, no, we really liked it. Check this one out. And I did, and it was a really, really good, enjoyable adaptation. So it's Douglas Campfield, so of course it's military. Of course it's World War II, because it's Douglas Campfield. And it's just really interesting. It's got a really good World War II location setting. It's got a really cool Troughton era style science fiction conceit at the centre of it, and it's just really, really well done. Fraser's obviously having a great time. Wendy Padbury's having a great time. Now, Michael Troughton plays the second Doctor, and I will say he gets closer than anyone I've heard before. I have heard a couple where Fraser Hines has played the second Doctor. And look, Fraser's quite good at doing a sort of an impression of Patrick Troughton if he's telling a story. Like, I said this and Troughton said this, and sort of doing Troughton's voice for half a sentence. He's very good at that. I don't think that Fraser's very good at long-form Troughton. And there was one story, one Cyberman story I listened to. There were points I literally couldn't tell who was Jamie and who was the second Doctor.
Right.
Whereas this one, Michael Troughton occasionally sounds exactly like his father. Sometimes it's a little bit off, and sometimes I have to go, oh, that's right, he's playing Patrick Troughton okay. It wasn't perfect, but it was closer than I've seen before. Mm-hmm. I do stand by my view that if you're going to get somebody replacing an actor, then you should be brave enough to put their photo on the cover, not the other one. So if you've got Michael Troughton playing the second Doctor, be brave enough to put Michael Troughton's face on the cover, not Patrick Troughton. That's my one bit of editorialising for that. Mm-hmm. But look, this was a really good adventure. It's stuck very neatly to 25 minutes episodes, which is something Big Finish hasn't done a lot, and I always think they're better when they do. So that was a really positive one. Then one that we've been talking about, both of us getting into and listening to for a while, Rob, and I finally did, and that is I, Davros.
Right.
I worked through this over the course of a couple of weeks, and I have to say this would be a genuine contender for the best Big Finish production I have heard.
Very good. Yeah, I've always heard good things about it. Yeah.
Yeah, it is exceptionally well written. It's got 4 different writers for each of the parts, which I think helps. For me, the standout was absolutely part 1, Innocence, which goes back to, very young Davros, sort of like, young teenager Davros, where he's played by Rory Jennings, who of course was in Doctor Who in The Idiot's Lantern. Mm-hmm. So that works really, really well. And just creating this world, I think, is really good. They add a lot of depth to Genesis of the Daleks and that world of the Khalids, and indeed the Thals, that I think is really, really good. The only criticisms I have, Terry Malloy plays Davros from part 2 onwards, and Terry Malloy is very good as, muted in the chair Davros. Terry Malloy, aged like 50 or 60-something, playing 20-year-old Davros, didn't quite work. And it's like, look, I can see what you're doing there, Terry, and he's trying to do the young voice, but it just feels like, you can always feel his throat just like struggling, stop doing this to me, we can't do this for 3 hours. But look, he's still a very, very good actor. It totally didn't need the framing story around it of Davros on trial from the Daleks, and I'm convinced that which added nothing to the story, there was no resolution to it at the end, it was just there. I'm convinced so that Nick Briggs could get involved and play with his ring modulator, and I just, that was a complete waste. But look, it was great, good characters, it was ruthless, it was dark, it was brutal. I mean, the death count must be about 95% or something. Nice. Nyder does turn up, but again, it's not like, oh, let's make Davros and Nyder childhood friends and having all 4 parts. It's no. At a very natural point when Davros would meet Nyder coming up through the ranks, they meet. So they really resisted that. There were some nice fan moments where there were like little sentences you use or reference. You go, oh, I get that. He's a fan. So yeah, look, really, really positive. I could talk long about that. Mm-hmm. Also very positive, I listened to 2 Hartnell era stories, both of them sort of pegged by William Russell, and the second one with Caroline Ford. The first was Library at Alexandria, which is set at the Library of Alexandria at the time that it was destroyed. That was a really, really good story. It's told by William Russell, who is a fantastic storyteller and just does really, really well. He captures the first Doctor really well. He's not doing a sort of a perfect impression, but he captures the spirit and the speaking style of Hartnell really, really well. But that's just it was a really good story. It had some good interactions between Ian and Barbara. It had a good adventure, and it just captured that season 1 historical really, really well. And the other one I went to was Domain of the Void, which was a longer one. That's got more of a cast in it, but it has got William Russell and Caroline Ford doing it. Written by Andrew Smith of Full Circle fame, and of course containing the Void. Not as good as Library of Alexandria, but still a very enjoyable story. A little bit longer than perhaps needed to be. Again, the episodes are sort of 30-something minutes rather than 25, which is always a fault, in my view anyway. But look, it was a good adventure. It was a useful sequel to the Void. And to me, it was like, okay, if the production team had said, oh, these Void were really popular, we've got the costumes, let's do another story. This was a really good exploration of them, and it was really good. So, look, for me to have 4 out of 4 big finishes that I thought they were really good and really enjoyable, and I want to come on and tell everybody how much I enjoyed, that's incredibly unusual for me, as you know, Rob.
Yes.
But as I say, credit to other fans out there, including some of our listeners on Twitter, who I occasionally have these conversations with as well, just being able to sort of better curate my Big Finish list through other podcasts and friends is absolutely changing that experience. And I'm not about to dive into sort of dozens of Big Finishes a month, but I think I am now going to just, buy a few more here and there because I now have a better way of knowing what I'm going to enjoy.
Yeah, I think you're more open to the idea now that you've had some good experiences versus some of the random misses you've had in the past.
Yeah, I think that's a very good way of putting it.
Alrighty then, shall we move on to our main topic?
We should, because, I came into season 12 when we did our podcast on that, which has, 6 stories with, a few notes. I've come into season 24 with only 14 episodes, but I have a lot of notes.
Good Lord. Well, look, as we said at the start of the episode, you guys did vote for this. I've got the stats in front of me, Dave. Season 24 won the poll with 39.6% of the vote. Pertwee came in at 29.7%, then it fell away to season 3 with TENNANT 18.9%, and the 2013 specials, which I'd still really like us to do one day, on 11.7%. So by far and away the winner. If you're out there listening, I'm sure you're going to be delighted we're about to talk about it.
No, absolutely. And Rob, I think we do need to do Series 3 at some point, and whether we put our thumbs on the scales or just pick it one day or whatever, I don't know, but I think that's one we do need to do.
Absolutely. Now, we like to kick these off with when we first saw these seasons, these classic seasons, Dave. And I think the first thing I want to say is that season 24 first aired here in Australia from the 31st of October 1988. So we're literally 36 years on from it airing this very month. And that's where I would have seen it all and in order. But I did get to see some episodes before that. But I'll pause there and just see what you make of that first.
Well, one of the reasons I'm very excited to talk about this season, Rob, is it represents 3 firsts for me.
Okay.
It's the first season I can properly remember watching as a kid. So I have memories of images of a few later Davison stories. I have memories of a few little sort of moments from Colin Baker stories. But by the time this aired, I was 8, and I can properly remember being a fully functional child and watching this and actually consuming it properly. So this is the first season going out on first broadcast I can remember that way. It's the first season that screened after Dad and I joined fandom in July of 1987. So this is the first time we had the local fan scene with previews and news and casting news, and these are the names of the stories, even though it wasn't always quite accurate, particularly by the time it sort of got out here to Australia. So that was important. And it's also, and I think this is perhaps where you're about to go, the first time I saw some eps before they aired in Australia.
Yes, that's where I'm about to go.
Well, I'll let you go there first, and then I'll tell you my experiences.
All right. Because season 24 in the UK, which was later in 87, dovetailed with me having come into fandom and being madly into fandom, I did get to see a lot of it before it was on TV here. And I went back to our local club fanzine, The White Guardian, and found little bits of information from when we had gone to these so-called parties at Sydney University where, episodes would be shown, and there are details of what we saw and all of this. And I learned that on the 18th of October, 1987, Time and the Rani episode 1 was played at a party at Sydney Uni that I was at. So I know I saw the first episode a bit over a month from the UK transmission. Then in another edition of the fanzine, it says on the 21st of February 1988, they played Dragonfire at an event. So I saw Dragonfire probably next after seeing an episode of Time and the Rani. Sometime after that, Delta and the Bannermen got played at an event, and it was an event with Dudley Simpson appearing. And my review, because I wrote the review for this one, actually notes that we missed some of Delta because we were hanging around waiting for Dudley's autograph, but there's no date for that, so I'm not sure exactly when that happened. Long story short, starting in late 1987 and running through 1988 before it appeared on Australian TV at the end of the year in October, I believe I'd pieced together season 24 pretty well between the parties and the tapes that were getting passed around fan groups.
Interesting. Slightly similar to my experience, I was at a video night that the club ran, which was very rare. We usually did day meetings, but every now and then they did a video night on a Saturday evening, I think it would have been. And so Dad and I both went in. We saw The Edge of Destruction there. I remember seeing the Sontaran Experiment there. But they did show part 1 of Time and the Rani there. And that, for all of us, I think, in that room, was the first glance we had at the Seventh Doctor and of his era. And then at a club meeting a few months later, which was at somebody's front room somewhere, back in those days, more often than not, we met in somebody's house rather than in a proper meeting hall. Wow. They had a copy of Dragonfire. So the first full McCoy story I saw was Dragonfire in somebody's living room at a club event. The rest of it, though, I did see when it was broadcast in 1988. And of course, we are obliged to mention that the ABC went straight into Remembrance of the Daleks. So we got 5 stories, not 4, as part of that run.
Yeah, and this also marked here in Australia the show going into dedicated children's TV programming. And I think that's important to note too. Now, I don't know whether that was just someone planning ahead and thought, oh, we need something to stick into the afternoon show, because that was the wrapper program around children's programming in the afternoons. I don't know whether someone just thought, oh, we need a children's show, stick Doctor Who in there, it's for kids. Or whether someone had actually watched season 24 in advance and thought, okay, this is kind of extra childish to what Doctor Who has been. We can't lead into the news with this, but we can stick it in afternoon programming, for kids. And I'm kind of inclined to think the latter, because I think season 24 is a markedly different program to even season 23.
Yeah, I actually had a very, very similar note here, because it was a very big deal for Australian fans, because for 15 years or more. And indeed, if you listen to our Gin and TARDIS on the Gunfighters, even going back to season 3, not consistently, but as early as season 3, Doctor Who was shown here in that 6 to 7 block, which was the lead into the main ABC 7pm news bulletin. And in that case, it was paired with stuff like The Goodies, Sweet and Sour, Yes Minister, those sort of programs. It was very family viewing, Australian or British television leading into the news. And yes, then it was put into the 5:30 slot, where it was paired with young adult TV shows. So the Ghosts of Motley Hall, Kids of Degrassi Junior High, or and the various Degrassi stuff. You can't do that on television. Those sort of shows. So it was a very different block of television programming, and it did mean that I've got friends in fandom. People like Richard and Mark will talk about the fact that they were now out of school and working, and suddenly being home for Doctor Who at 5:30 was actually a bit harder to do. And so It was very easy to go, I didn't like the first couple, I have to set a recorder for them, maybe I won't bother this time. But certainly when you take the reaction of fandom to season 24 and the change in time slot, a lot of us did add 2 and 2, and whether we got 4 or got 4.5, I don't know. But certainly there did seem to be a sense of fandom didn't like this series very much, and we'll talk about that as we go through it. The initial reaction was not good from fans down here, with a couple of exceptions, and it was put in the kids slot, so this is all part of the same chicken and egg thing. Yeah,
it's interesting times. Some initial thoughts before we get into the episodes, Dave. I, this time around, watched the extended versions of each story, and somewhat embarrassingly, I couldn't tell what was extended and what wasn't on the whole. with the exception of Dragonfire, as sometimes there's a blurring on the screen, and I think what it's blurring out is numbers, like an on-screen runtime from a rough edit of the story that they've managed to get their hands on and pull the extra clips from, and they've just blurred out the numbers on the screen. But aside from that visual cue, I didn't really have any idea when I was seeing new, so to speak, footage or not, which is somewhat embarrassing. But putting that aside, I had a better time than I thought I would have. You go into this thinking, you go into season 24 thinking, there's the non-Cartmel story, then there are 3 Cartmel stories, and that sort of sits in your head and colours things from the start. But I really tried to give this as fresh eyes as possible this time around.
Yeah, likewise. I did watch some of it. I think I remember talking about this as a short topic a few years ago when the set came out. I certainly watched a few, and I watched some of the docos and the behind the sofas and all the rest of it. So I haven't seen it since then, but that would have been the only time in quite a while that I have seen it. And it was interesting to sit down and watch it again. I did go into it with that sort of back of the head thing of, look, is this the worst Doctor Who season ever? Probably not. But is it a contender objectively? Look, probably it is. Just, if nothing else, because of just how rushed this was into production. And look, I think we all know the story. J&T thinks he's finished at the end of season 23, goes off on holiday, gets back and says, what's my new posting at the BBC? And they say, oh, actually, you're doing Doctor Who again. He's going, oh, okay. You need to go find a script editor. Oh, and you need to go sack the Doctor and find another Doctor. And there are no scripts. So, like, we all know that that's what happened, and it was a ridiculously rushed production. And I think we all know that the McCoy era does get better as it goes on. And I've often talked about, with this season, the concept of turning the ship, in that Cartmel comes in, Time of the Rani's already in production. I suspect it's not quite as in production as he likes to pretend it is, because he does sort of say, oh, Time of the Rani was nothing to do with me. I came in after that. But then he's got stories about arguing with Pip and Jane Baker about whether they're going to have the intro with Solomon, and his decree about cutting the baby in half, and the argument with Pip and Jane about that. So, I think it's Pip and Jane that tell that story. So maybe Cartmel's just like, I never spoke to Pip and Jane Baker. It had nothing to do with me. And Pip and Jane are like, well, we had these arguments with Andrew Cartmel, and so he clearly was involved.
Yes.
Andrew, spin's good, but hey, facts. But look, I'm sure that he didn't commission that story. He wasn't involved in the plotting of that story. He would have come in at the drafting process. But then to turn a ship around takes time. And something I want to explore as we go through is that way in which Cartmel is sort of turning this story from the opening moments of Time of the Rani through the end of Dragonfire, and kind of then being at where he, and indeed McCoy, want the Seventh Doctor's era to go. The other thing that I think was really interesting and that I had in my mind as I was watching it is the writers who wrote for this are a bit of a sea change for the show, because a lot of the people that wrote for Doctor Who in the 60s and the 70s were not professional writers in the sense of they became writers out of school and did courses and all the rest of it. Most of them are people who were doing other jobs or working part-time and just, wrote something and sent it off to various different agents and various different script editors, and then got a gig. Oh, yeah, you can do an episode of this. We'll do you on an episode of this. And suddenly, they're writing. Terrence Dix got involved that way. Robert Holmes was a policeman who got involved that way. Many of them, were writing, or they were journalists and started to write for television. Whereas in this era, we've got a lot of younger writers that Cartmel has gone and found who are much more I want to be a writer, and out of school I'm going to writer's school, and I'm going to do a BBC course, and I'm going to come up through a BBC program, and I'm going to go and work in this unit. And they are professionals in a much different sense to the way that former writers were, and with a very sort of young 80s vibe about them. I mean, you can feel in this group of writers, these are people that grew up watching not the 9 o'clock news and the young ones and that sort of, alternate comedy sort of scene. Yeah. Because a lot of these stories, there is stuff where you go, that's a really cool idea. How does it relate to the rest of the plot of a real world? It doesn't, but it's a cool idea. And you can see that sort of different style of writing here. So these are some themes that I'm looking forward to expanding upon as we get into the season.
All right. Well, one of the things we should probably discuss before we hit the first story is the fact that this season has new music and a new title sequence. Do you want to just briefly touch on that?
I have come to love the title sequence graphics. I think that it's nice to have something that's not a time tunnel. And I think it actually looks quite good. It's quite colourful. Yes, the CGI TARDIS is obviously very CGI, but I kind of like it. It's colourful, it's exciting, it's fun. I, to this day, can't decide if I like the Keff McCoy theme. I think it probably is, for me, the weakest of all the classic themes. Mm-hmm. I give it points for trying something different, but it's just a little bit too tinny, I think, for me to really land.
I get a real nostalgia hit from it just because, I'm in fandom and I'm seeing these episodes in such a cheeky way on, pirate video tapes. And I just have all of that sort of background to it, that when you see that flash of red at the start and the music starts, I do get a little frisson of excitement, which isn't really based on how good the music is, because I don't think it is particularly good. I agree with you there. but I do get a real sort of nostalgia hit from it. And I thought the credits were really cool at the time. I thought they were doing something new and different. The only thing I didn't like was the new logo.
Yeah, I don't think the new logos really stood the test of time.
No, I didn't like it at the time. It never grew on me, and I look at it now and I'm still not into it.
Look, I agree, but this is a TV show that's 23 years old, doing its 24th year. And if you're not willing to roll the dice and go, let's just do something different, let's try and freshen this up. It may not work, but let's try. I think you're probably going to fail anyway. So even though I don't think the logo works, and I don't quite think the music works, at least it's not working trying.
Yeah, I'll agree with that, 100%. Yeah. Shall we get into the episodes?
We shall. Do you want to kick us off with Time in the Rani, or shall
I? Why don't you this time?
Okay. This is a really difficult story to assess. I think my opening gambit is to say, overall, it doesn't come together. It does, however, have a lot of really cool things in it, and it certainly won a few praises, not for the story itself at the time, but for aspects of the story at the time. And the things that I remember fandom praising back in 1988 when it screened here are, I think, the things that have stood the test of time. But where it's bad, it's very bad. And the final opening point I'll just make is I got a real sense in here of a director just not giving a toss. Now, I'm not sure if that's the case, because it's Andrew Morgan, who then did Remembrance of the Daleks, so he's clearly capable. Now, I don't know whether it was just amazingly rushed, or people didn't quite know what they were doing, or he just didn't care. But the number of shots that should have been retakes, or where the editing is just really poor, like moments where somebody points and there's a pause before somebody reacts, or somebody has to grab someone who has to stand still for half a beat because they're not quite ready. There's just lots of really bad shots and really bad choices and really bad line deliveries. Either it was horribly rushed, or the director was just, that'll do, let's get this in the can. Because for all the good things in there, there were plenty of bad things.
Yeah. There's an idea, I think, bubbling away in the core of this story with time manipulation and fixing evolution, and these seem like very Rani things to be interested in, and I think they're very interesting things in general. But how it all fits together and how everything came to be in the days, weeks, months before the Doctor arrived, it's really hard to believe in this as a story. And for a big new Doctor Who is back, we've got a new Doctor, we've got new music, and so on. We're really just in a quarry throwing around flowery language, which if you went to school the next day and tried talking like that, you'd probably get bashed by the other kids.
You can write this stuff, but you can't say it.
There you go. It's so frustrating. And even McCoy's, I can sort of do Buster Keaton, so let's go with that. And he starts doing pratfalls and skidding around corners on one leg. It just gets old super fast. And I know when we put this one on that we know it's the one, it's the Doctor Who written by old people from the old regime who think, Doctor Who is all about that flowery language first and foremost. Sadly, all of that just remained true, no matter how much of a fresh eyes I tried to give it.
I once listened to an interview with Will Wheaton, who played Wesley Crusher on Star Trek The Next Generation, and he was making a lot of fun of early episodes of TNG, and he said, look, as fans now, we can make fun of and point out the very big flaws in early episodes of TNG, because we know not that far down the path is I am Locutus of Borg and there are four lights. Like, we know that great stuff's coming. And I feel the same about Time in the Rani. I am going to say I think that McCoy's performance in here is appallingly bad, but I can say that knowing that much, much better performances are coming.
Yeah.
That first episode, and these first couple of scenes, I had Space Babies levels of looking around the room, just making sure nobody was watching me watching this. Because I just thought, this is terrible. And McCoy clearly doesn't know what he's meant to do. He hasn't had time to properly find his character. Nobody's really probably helped him find his character. Andrew Morgan probably isn't involved in that. Jane T's just trying to get the show put together. Andrew Cartman's trying to work out, where his key for his desk is. And McCoy's just like, I don't know what I'm doing. And it clearly shows. And he's just pratfalling. He's big. He's grandiose. I get that there's this sort of... Pip and Jane are trying to write him as like the last vestiges of Colin's Doctor sort of going. But it just comes along as him just being a fool, basically. There are some moments of McCoy in this, but overall, it is, by some measure, the weakest performance he gives as the Doctor. And that's unfortunate, given it is his first impression.
Yeah. Something I do think they get right, though, with Sylvester is the costume. I think they get it really right, particularly in terms of the silhouette. And I'm very big into this idea of characters needing the right silhouette. And I particularly think of Indiana Jones when I think of this. You know, when you see the hat, you see that short jacket in silhouette, Indiana Jones works. And I think Sylvester here works. I think they've put the right type of clothes on him, aside from putting that damn jumper on him that they gave him that looks silly. The actual look of the costume, the way it sits on him, it feels very right to me. And I was just looking, there's even one scene where he is actually in silhouette. I think it's where he goes into the Tetrap cave or something, and you do see him in silhouette, and with the hat and the short jacket, the baggy pants, it's like, yes, that looks like a character to me. That's just not someone standing there wearing clothes. That's a character. That works. You know, so I think the costume designer should get a bit of a shout out here.
No, I utterly agree. I think McCoy's costume really does work. I think you're right about the silhouette. I actually quite like the tartan scarf he has here.
Yeah, which he loses straight away.
Yeah, I get that it's probably a bit too knowing, like, oh, he's a Scottish actor, he's got a tartan scarf. I get that, but I think it looks quite good. I've got to admit, although as fans we're trained to say we hate the question mark pullover, I didn't notice it here.
Is it because half of it's tucked in?
Well, yeah, I don't know whether it is because it's tucked in and the jacket's over, but I wasn't sitting there going, oh, look at that jumper, it's terrible. It didn't sort of jump out at me. So, look, I agree that's a really good choice. And, in fact, I was going to say a lot of the production work is actually really good on this. The Rani's lab scene is actually a pretty cool scene for 1987 Doctor Who budget. It's colourful, it's got some different shapes and the triangles. Her console being an upside down pyramid is a nice cool idea. So there's different things there. The Tetrap's lair actually looks like a lair. And the things that I remember fandom praising at the time and that did really well in some polls about best special effects and best ideas were the Tetraps and the bubble traps. Because look, okay, the Tetraps now look like a very cheap piece of early animatronics. But having come off the back of the Colin Baker era, they looked pretty cool. And there was actually a new monster, which was a rarity in 80s Doctor Who, having a good, cool new monster. It's got the four eyes sort of concept and the way that it... the point of view shots where, the four different eyes go and focus on one was really good. So I like the Tetraps. They're a good concept. The bubble traps look really cool. Yeah. And that was, again, a moment I remember fans going, oh, we haven't seen that before. That's really cool. So those were things that definitely did stand in the production. Unfortunately, the location footage is just a quarry.
Yeah. Well, look, even the paint box effects, I think we've taken strides on from Mind Warp.
Yes.
Which wasn't that long ago.
No, it was only a season ago. Yeah, and no, they've clearly learned how to do paint box a lot more subtly than it was done in Mind Warp, which is really, really cool. A couple of things that I want to talk about that don't work, and really most of it comes down to the plot and the writing. I get what they're trying to go for with Lacertia and the Lacertians, but it just doesn't come across on screen at all. This idea of them being this sort of, indolent race that's been brought up in a paradise, and it's like four dudes lazing about in a very bad, rec centre in a quarry. Like that just doesn't work. The writing isn't very, very good. And a lot of things that you think if there'd been more time would have been revised doesn't quite come off. Like Bayus dies because Bayus has to die. There's no actual practical reason for him to stand in that room at all. Again, I kind of get the narrative idea of he was the collaborator who has to redeem himself by sacrificing himself, but it doesn't really come off. I also get that originally it was meant to be a Colin Baker story where the Doctor had to stay back and he was the one that gets blown up and that causes the regeneration. So I get where it's coming from, but it doesn't work. And I'm just sitting there going, Bayus, just go to the other side of the door. But clearly all the Tetraps have left by now. The Rani's left by now. So if you just looked outside the door, you'd see there's no one to guard this place from and you'd be okay. And the reality is that the entire plot of this thing is only really resolved by the Doctor delaying a countdown by a couple of seconds and, famously a launch ramp that doesn't have a hinge. And so there are all these little things that sort of don't work. And like you, Rob, I get to part 4 and I go, okay, the central premise of here is a cool Pip and Jane Baker big science fiction idea, but it's not seeded. The idea of, oh, there's something behind that door is seeded well, but there's no sense of sort of dropping hints about the Rani's plan to really land it. You get to part 4 and there's just a big info dump and then we blow some stuff up and it's all okay.
Yeah, I hear. Just one more little point from me. I had an interesting memory cheats moment watching this. I thought when the insects were released that there was a real swarm of them. You know, those little light things zipping all over the place, and that they killed heaps of Lacurtians. But in the end, it's only a few glowy things and not a lot of deaths. There are some deaths, but I'd somehow built that up into being a much bigger scene over the years than I remembered.
Yeah, I agree. That's a really poor scene. And it does just sort of reinforce this idea that we have no proper sense of a Lacurtian society outside of the couple in the Rani's headquarters, Icona, and, 4 people in the centre of pleasure or leisure or whatever it is. Like, there's no real sense of a proper society out there, which is a problem. The memory cheats moment for me, and it's the final point I want to make, is I knew that Kate O'Mara does a Bonnie Langford impression in this. I hadn't realised that it's almost 2 whole episodes. It's like the Rani's second scene. She gets in the Mel costume, and she's there until the cliffhanger of episode 2. I just thought this is 2 whole episodes of a 4-parter. This is way more than I thought. And again, the first couple of scenes, I was sort of like, okay, this is kind of fun. This is kind of interesting. But by the 3rd or 4th scene, I'm like, I'm so over this. Yeah. And I don't think Kate O'Mara is nearly as good in this as she was in Mark of the Rani. I think that she is coming back. She's a bit loose. She's a bit more over the top. She's a star now because she's done Dynasty at this point, I think. And it's not for me. So that's a good summary. Like, there's a lot of little things I like. There's a lot of things I can understand why it didn't work, but this didn't work.
For a score?
I'm giving it a D. I'm sorry, I can't go better.
I can't go past 5 out of 10.
Yeah, that's fair.
Alrighty. Moving on to Paradise Towers. I was struck on this viewing, Dave, with how comic book this is. And I probably shouldn't say comic book because that's now synonymous with big budget Marvel superheroes, and obviously this is nothing like that.
Yeah.
So maybe I should say cartoony or comic book, We just have all these situations that make little sense and people behaving in really non-realistic ways. But when you start thinking about it in terms of comic book panels, it suddenly makes sense. Even Peck's declaring that he puts the world of Paradise Towers to rights. It looks and it sounds cringe on screen, but you imagine that as a panel or two in a comic. And yes, that works perfectly. That's what someone would say in a comic book, and you'd read that guy. Yeah, that's great.
Totally.
In a comic book world, this is quite right. That's my opening gambit.
Yeah, that's not the exact note that I had, but it's similar to some of the early notes I had. I think that there are a lot of really good ideas and elements in Paradise Towers. I totally get where this story is coming from. I as somebody who grew up watching The Bill at a similar sort of time, and particularly into the late 80s, early 90s, all of us who, and many of us in Australia watched The Bill, knew what the Jasmine Allen estate was and what these estate blocks in London were and why they didn't work. So I get where that's coming from. I get the J.G. Ballard inspiration of it. Lots of things here are really good. The cast is, for a show that is in many ways, flailing and dying, the cast is spectacular. Richard Bryars, Judy Cornwall, Clive Merrison. This is a really, really strong guest cast. Except for where it's not. We'll get to that. The costume design is really, really good. The set designers had a lot of detail going on. Some of the special effects are really good. Look, I think the cleaners design, even though they're a bit slow and they're obviously a bit clunky, the design of the cleaners is really good. The design of the pool monsters is really good. There's a lot of really clever stuff going on here. There's a lot of interesting ideas about the corruption of language, corruption of names, the use of the corporate catchphrase "build high for happiness" becoming just a retort. It's all very, very clever, and I genuinely am not quite sure why it all doesn't come together as well as it should. I probably again have to look at the director, who in this case is Nicholas Mallet, who went on to do The Curse of Fenric. So once again, I was all set to look at this director and go, this is terrible, who was it? Oh, what else did he do? Okay, well, he's not incapable, because Curse of Fenric is brilliant. But once again, there are some directorial choices that don't work. There are a number of lines, particularly from some of the very new actresses, a couple of whom they say on the doco, as an aside, Rob, this was the one story where I got to the end of it and go, I need to know what happened here. I'm going to watch the doco.
Oh, really?
All the other ones I was like, I need to push on and finish watching the actual series. This was one I've gone, no, I'm going to start an extra round and watch the doco because I want to really understand a bit more about what happened here. And yes, there were actresses who this was their first job in television. And there's one line where the Blue Kang leader sort of has this, but Blue Kangs have won. And you just go, why was there not another take? Why did the director not say to the actor, look, hey, you're doing really well, love your enthusiasm, let's try some different line readings. And, that would have been really, really good. I have many, many more thoughts, but that's a really big summary of just so many elements I love, and I kind of like it. But it doesn't quite work.
Yeah, well, to touch on some of what you were talking about, I think the world building is also really solid. There's those attempts at a form of slang from the Kangs, which I think sometimes works really well.
Yes.
And sometimes doesn't. The idea that people have gone off to fight in a war and no one knows who even won the war, that's interesting. But again, it's still sort of cartoonish because you start asking yourself, okay, well, where does anyone get their food from now?
Yes.
They can't all be cannibals like Tilda and Tabby. Why do the Kangs not know what boys are? Were no boy children left behind? How old is Peck supposed to be? Do none of the Kangs realise he is a boy? Is no one having sexual urges at all? I mean, how do they have curiosity and the ability to use the telecommunication system to do all their forward scouting and all of that, but not the curiosity to know what's in a drink machine? You start poking holes in it and it falls apart. But watching it as a more heightened, this is a comic book come to life, again, it's not actually terrible.
I have very, very similar thoughts to you. And this comes back to some of the stuff I foreshadowed at the start of our conversation. I can see what the writers are trying to do, and I can see that sense of, you know what, we've got these set pieces, we've got these ideas. Do they necessarily work as a coherent traditional narrative? No, they don't. But that's okay because it tells the story we want it to tell. And I get that it works on that sort of level because I had very similar notes about all the background. Also, the caretakers. What age were they when they were shipped across here? Because I think the intent of the writer, according to the doco, was that they were all sort of sent across in their 40s and they're now in their 50s. And so they're just these old sort of, couldn't find the war has-beens, and that doesn't come across.
No.
And again, part of it's a budgetary thing, right? You can't have 100 different extras on set in a Doctor Who story to make it feel like there's a real society going on here. You've got 12. So, the Regis are 5 people. The Kangs are 12 people. The caretakers are 3 people. So, I get that's a budgetary limitation, but it does mean that it doesn't all quite work. And if you're doing this today, you would have those scenes of bigger extras. You'd have the sort of the quirky, this is how we get our food scene, when it's some sort of weird food dispenser or something. You'd get all that. But that's not what they're doing here now. But I will say it does land as a thematic story about a broken, dysfunctional society that has to learn to work together to defeat a common enemy, and at the end has become a better society for it via the influence of the Doctor. I think that narrative is a good one. It does work, it is seated correctly, and it does land. So even if the traditional narrative that we are looking for there doesn't work, the point of it does work, and that's where you can feel the cart more turning the ship thing. It's certainly not fully turned at this stage, but you can start to get the sense of what he wants to do with the show, and there are a few of those darker moments that the MCCOY will become known for. Just the lightest of dark, but you can start to see that.
Yeah, I actually have a note about that, because I think the Doctor is pretty much in character here, particularly after the last story. And I know there's this received fan wisdom that, MCCOY goes dark in season 25, and then he's darker again in season 26. But even here, and this might be what you're referring to, we have Pex declaring that he's going to go on the mission to get Cro-Agnon, and MCCOY is all dark and like, so be it, and he's not comedic at all. And you sort of know that he knows that Pex is going to die, and he's just, so be it, you know. That's all happening with McCoy here, and I never really see people acknowledge that that darker aspect of his character is actually here in the second story of season 24.
Yeah, I think you're right. I think that having struggled to know what to do in Time of the Rani, he's now got a better sense of what he's trying to do, and he's trying to make it work within the script. That is a good moment. The stuff where he's watching the Canes taunt Pex, he doesn't sit there and go, stop teasing him, that's wrong. He just looks at them and says, this is the society we need to fix. And it's a very sort of background doctor, and I think that does work. There's another scene that I think emulates a lot of what we've been talking about, and that's the scene where he uses the rule book to get away from the caretakers. And there's part of me going, this is such a wonderful, quirky doctor scene, I kind of like it. And there's also part of me going, the caretakers are unrealistically stupid.
Yeah.
And that detracts from the caretakers. So that scene to me sort of captures I get what they're trying to do, kind of works in the right mood, but it doesn't work as a proper piece of the drama.
But again, works in a comic book. You put that in 3 or 4 panels in a comic book, and it makes perfect sense.
Yeah, absolutely. Speaking of Pex, I actually really like Pex. I've come to like him more as I've got a little bit older, and I think when you're a kid and you see Pex as an older person, it doesn't quite work. Now that I'm old enough to look at Pex and go, wow, he's just a kid, it actually does quite work. I like that sense of a sort of a 19, 20-year-old bloke who actually doesn't really know what his place in the world is actually terrified inside, but wants to be big and brave and masculine and you know, all the rest of it. I think that actually does work. I like his desire to be the brave one at the end and do it. I like the fact that he's just a terrified 19-year-old and he panics and messes the plan up, but then he's the one that sacrifices himself. I think that all works really well. I think the performance is good. I like Pex. I think Pex works. Pex lives.
Question without notice. Richard Breyer's moustache grows after he becomes Cro-Agnon. Would it not have been better if he had the big bushy unkempt moustache originally, and then when he becomes Cro-Agnon and becomes evil, he gets the more streamlined Hitler moustache?
Probably yes, but look, let's open the Cro-Agnon box.
Okay.
Cro-Agnon is terrible in both his forms. I spoke about the production values here, and mostly they are very, very good. But that box with 2 flashing lights on top going, hungry, my God, is that embarrassing. That is just bad. And you know, even as a kid, I wasn't particularly excited to find out what that thing was, because it just looked terrible. And as an adult, look, it looks really terrible. And again, Breyer's performance, he has good moments as the chief caretaker. I really like him in the cliffhanger of part 1, the kill him. Yeah, there's a really good sort of just banality of evil he's going for there sometimes. Then when he sort of tries to get all, Daddy doesn't want you to do this, you just go, oh, come on, no, don't do it that way. Yeah. And then when he plays Cro-Agnon, again, you watch the doco and he talks about this idea of this personality put into a body it's not used to and getting used to it. And I go, okay, that makes sense for the first scene. But by his second or third scene, he needs to be an in-control, scary villain. And just the, like, drunk stirring and slaggering around completely undermines the villain. And even the highlight, which should be, you know, the sacrifice of Pex, is completely undermined by Richard Breyer just going, oh! And he's going, oh, come on. This should be the big sacrifice moment, a really serious, dramatic moment, and you're completely undercutting it. So, look, I think Cro-Agnon is a big fail that I just can't defend.
I can't disagree with any of that, Dave, honestly.
Yeah, and look, it all just comes back to, I think this would be saved by just a few extra takes and a bit more love from the director. Even the episode 1 cliffhanger, which I think is a nice little sort of interesting piece of scripting, though. Hey, they think he's the great architect. Who's the great architect? Oh, and now they want to kill him. What's going on? Credits. Is really good. But in the middle of it, you literally have one of the caretakers doing the all hail the great architect, just playing it for laughs.
Oh, and they put their hands in front of their mouth like they're doing the Hitler moustache impersonation.
Yeah,
like, just what's that all about?
Yeah, and again, that's just another thing. I could see where this is going. I actually quite like it. I'm going to say it's my second favourite of the season. I love the ideas. I love lots of the actors. I love the design. I love the premise. I think the The story arc works. It's got cannibal old ladies, and that's really cool. So much in here I love, but so many little directorial choices just don't come together.
What's your score?
I'm giving it a B.
Okay. I'm giving it a 6 out of 10, so better than Time in the Rani for sure.
Better than Time in the Rani, not as big a step up as I'm giving it, though.
No.
Interesting. Shall I go into Delta and the Bannermen?
Please.
This was very interesting to watch. It's by far the one that I've watched the least over the years. And that's largely to do with the fact that when I was 8, I didn't like this story. I didn't hate this story. I was massively indifferent to this story. And watching it now, I don't know who this was written for in 1987. Because nobody born after about 1975 that should be watching Doctor Who in 1987 has nostalgia for the 50s. Nor do they have nostalgia for 1950s terrible English battle and holiday camps. And us in Australia certainly have no nostalgia for that. No kid in 1987 is worried about 1950s rock and roll or messages about love or anything like that. And as an 8-year-old, I just watched this and went, none of this interests me at all. As an adult, I have a very different view, not necessarily a better view, but a very different view. But I'll throw to you, Rob, and just say, how did you come into this one?
Delta is, I think, Paradise Towers on steroids, because we're back in this heightened state where it makes no sense. People wouldn't act like this. We take massive leaps from scene to scene. But again, as a comic in a few panels, great. If I was reading this panel to panel, it would be a fun, compelling story. But when it's being acted out on screen, it just doesn't feel realistic. Even scenes I noted here, like Billy sitting down at the table with Delta, because he's going to finally make his move on her, and she storms off without even knowing a thing about him. Yet seemingly next time they meet, she's kind of into him. That works in a comic, but it works terribly as live action. It's like an amateur theatre group working through a first draft in places. But on the flip side, it's got all the location filming. It looks visually better than the previous story, even if no one is acting particularly normally. I think all of this is worth noting because it's new. You know, Doctor Who, as we've noted already, it's got its new script editor. He's putting a new stamp on things. He's got these new young writers. It feels different. And I think having something like this is 100 times better than what another series of Colin with Eric Saywood in charge would have been like, and so on. So the ship, as you refer to it, had to change direction at some point, and by this stage in season 24, I think you can feel Doctor Who is a totally different beast, and it is changing direction, the ship, that is.
No, yeah. I think that's absolutely true. I had to look back at some of the local fanzines at the time, and my God, did local fandom hate this when it came out. It came rock bottom of the season poll that the local club did, and a lot of people had a lot of negative things to say about it. Watching it now, I actually kind of appreciate it a lot more. Looking at it back through a prism of, 36 years of nostalgia, I totally get what it's trying to do. I get the weird and wacky vibe. I get the whimsy of the location footage and the 50s music. I get the sort of attempted allegory between the bees and the Shimmerans. I kind of get the romantic subplot. I think I appreciate Ray being spurned more than I do Delta falling for Billy. And again, it goes from like, these are sort of like grown-ups doing grown-up things that's all a bit weird and to me looking back and going, my God, Billy's a kid. Like, he's just a kid. And, it's sad that I'm old enough to just go, this guy's a kid. But and Ray looks even younger. And so I do appreciate it now, and I can let that wonderful, whimsical, quirky vibe of it wash over me and enjoy it in that sense.
Yeah. Oh, look, Ray deserves a mention now that you've brought her up. I remember watching this as I would have been, 13, almost 13 at the time. And thinking she could be a companion, and then learning years later that really wasn't an accident. It really was the plan to some degree, that someone needed to replace Mel, and Ray could have been it. I think in comparison to Sophie, though, Sophie as an actress, Ace as a character, they made the right decision. But Ray is such a really sweet character in so many ways. She's just not A tier. She's not solo companion material. It would have been wrong to have taken her on, but I quite like her as a character.
Yeah, I've liked her more and more as I've got older and appreciated her, and I think that's very true. Look, Rob, for everything I liked about this, I like the tone, I like the vibe. There are a number of weird, quirky moments. Like the fact that there's a toll booth in space. Like, why? Who cares? We're just going to do it.
Yeah.
I like the you are not the Glee singers from Swansea, but are actually a bunch of aliens from space on the run from other aliens. That's a really funny, quirky scene. For all the things I like in that, Rob, the plot makes no sense whatsoever. It's just weird, and I watched it, and again, as an adult, I can now go, I like the vibe, I like the tone, I can kind of smile at this wash over me, but I'm still sitting there going, who are the Shimmerans? Who are the Bannermen? Who is Gavrock? Why does he want to wipe out the Shimmerans? Why does he have to wipe out the last of them? Why are there only 6 of them? What's the Brood Planet? How does this work? And there's just so many aspects of it that just don't come together. I did go and read the novelisation. Sorry, no, that's a lie. I read the first and last chapters of the novelisation because I did have this very dim memory from 30 years ago of Malcolm Cole having some explanations in there, and they are in there. It sort of talks about how the Bannermen have polluted their own planet and it's now uninhabitable, so they need a new one, so they want the Shimmerans, which, okay, makes a sense of why they're just occupying it and taking it over. It doesn't quite explain the obsession with getting Delta, unless you really start to headcanon all the stuff about, well, she's like the queen bee, so if you let her get away, she can breed a whole new race of Shimmeran, and they're going to come back. And when she talks about the Brood Planet in the story, that is in the book, where they go to the Brood Planet, and it's like basically like a new beehive where Delta can just put pupas in all these cells or something. And then it has a bit where Billy flies all the Bannermen off to the Planet of Judgment or something, and everyone cheers because they've beaten the Bannermen. And so like there's sort of it's incredibly twee, but at least I think in Cole's mind there was a story there, but it doesn't come across in the story. Gavrock sort of goes from wickedly callous to totally inept. Again, in isolation, I can kind of laugh at the 2 Americans trying to find the satellite. Does it work in the middle of an alien invasion story of Doctor Who? Probably not. But again, it's as you say, it probably works in the comic book, and it works as a, hey, we're just going to have these 2 bumbling American agents that's just going to be fun. Why not?
Yeah.
I get it now.
Yeah. And could you have seen those characters in Arc of Infinity?
No.
No. Because Doctor Who has changed, in what, space of, 5 years?
Yes. No. Yeah. I think that's right. And I think it's the same thing we said about the opening credits, right? Does it necessarily work completely? I don't think so. But am I glad it's trying? Absolutely. And I will give it credit, having smashed the last 2 directors. Chris Clough is involved here, and there was nothing about the direction I faulted. And indeed, his location, well, I suppose it's all location work, but that particular outdoorsy location, those big shots, the motorbikes, all the rest of it, he films those really, really well. I think he does ramp the tension up quite well where he needs to. He does do lots of cool, menacing shots of Gavrock, and Don Henderson sort of plays up to that. I think the direction here is actually quite good, and that definitely helps to bring together a story compared to the last 2.
Yeah, fair. I want to mention briefly Garonway, because this was one of the first times I can recall in my fandom journey, if we can call it that, of coming across fan theories. And the fan theory here was that Garonway was a retired Time Lord, or even a retired Doctor. People would be like, look at that knowing look he gives at the end. And of course it was all bollocks. And I think it's the kind of thing that ruins watching new episodes of the show nowadays. A character raises an eyebrow and next thing they're Rassilon or something.
Or Susan.
Or Susan, yeah. But this was one of the first times I remember coming across this kind of phenomenon for myself. And it was a lot rarer in those days without the internet. Ideas just couldn't propagate as easily. But I do remember that being a very strong theory that was out there.
Yeah, I remember that coming across that as well. I don't think it stands up. And I think it's actually, as you say, to the detriment of the show. I think it's going for this bunch of very different, weird characters, and just having this man who's just a retired beekeeper who is so chill that even in the face of an alien invasion, he's just like, I just want to care about my bees. I think that's a really neat concept. I think that he does have some lovely lines. His interactions with McCoy are really good. McCoy, again, gets a few really nice moments. I don't think his confrontation with Gavrok quite works. I think that McCoy hasn't worked out how to play anger. I'm not sure he ever does work out how to play anger, just between you and me, Rob.
No.
But again, this is an example of the writers, particularly Cartmel, are starting to see, watching this, what the Seventh Doctor and what McCoy can do well. And so they go, okay, well, we give him brooding and indifferent and quiet. He's fantastic. When we give him shouting and angry and righteous, he's not so good. So let's write more and more of the former and much less of the latter. And so they start to work into his performance as well. Now normally for a Doctor, you'd be there by the end of their first season. They've got 14 rushed episodes, so it takes further to turn that ship.
Yeah, agree. Anything else before we give it a score, Dave?
Look, one last thing, and again, it's symptomatic of all the stuff we've been talking about all episode. The bees thing, I get. I can see what they're trying to do, that the bees have got this whole thing going on, and it's kind of analogous to the Shimmerans and all the rest of that. But again, do I think it really quite lands at a narrative level? Probably not, but it's nice, it's whimsical, and that for me I think sums up the whole story. Does it quite work as a piece of narrative? No. As an adult, do I appreciate the whimsy and the fun and the ideas? Yeah, I kind of do.
Yeah. And for me, I go back to the start. It's Paradise Towers on steroids, back into the heightened state. Agree with everything you said. For a score, I'd give this a 7 out of 10.
So this is your best so far?
It is so far.
This is, for me, between Paradise Towers and Time of the Rani. So I'm giving it a C+. That feels harsh to me as I look at it, but I can't give it more than I gave Paradise Towers. And I do think that it doesn't quite come together. But I feel bad giving it a low score because it is a lovely story.
Yeah, it is.
Dragonfire, Rob.
Yes, Dave. I had to do something odd with this one. It's obviously a story I saw decades ago, and I've seen many times since. And I've read the Target novel somewhere along the line as well, at least once. It was broadly the good one from the season because Ace was in it and all of that. So it's hardly an unknown quantity to me. But this time around, the odd thing I had to do was because I was trying to watch it with fresh eyes and understand it from scratch, I suddenly thought to myself, hang on, Kane was sent here as a prisoner with a jailer, the dragon, over 3,000 years ago, and he became essentially a supermarket manager. but a supermarket manager who has a private army. That's a very odd sort of situation. You know, I can see how if it was just a prison, you couldn't have people like Ace there at all. So it needs that conceit for someone like Ace to be there. But on the flip side, Kane is like this ice vampire prisoner, but is still day-to-day management enough that when a door ices up, he has to get told about it and fix it. It's very odd, isn't it, when you stop and think about it? In that way, I think, again, it's kind of Paradise Towers-esque. Here's a big idea that sounds really wild. I mean, we're even calling Ace Dorothy and having her carried off in a time storm like it's Wizard of Oz. So, yeah, there's all these big ideas here, but can you prod any of them and have it hold together? Does it hang together? There's my opening gambit.
You're absolutely right, Rob. This certainly won the local fan poll when this was screened as being the best of the season, and that certainly has been my memory of it. I have so many comments on what you've just raised there. I think that this is a really good adventure. I think that the central ideas are really good. It absolutely is Cartmel-esque on steroids. That idea of, hey, let's not have this just at a space station or a colony planet. Let's have it in a space freezer center. Why? Who cares? That's just weird. It's just different. And I'm just going to go with it. And it would never have happened in any other era of Doctor Who, but I just think it is different. It kind of works. And unlike certainly Paradise Towers and definitely Time of the Rani, you do get some sense that this is a real functioning place with staff, with living quarters, with customers. There are actually extras bustling around. Kane has people sort of bustling around his headquarters. There are people in the cafe. There are shoppers. A couple of things don't quite work later on, but I think that sense of world building actually does work, and that weirdness does come across quite well as well, and for me lands.
Really? Okay. Oh, that's good. It's good to hear. I certainly don't dislike this story. It's just that when I gave it those fresh eyes this time around, I just started to question things again and started to poke at things and just, again, why does Kane become a supermarket manager? That just kept coming into my head. It seems very strange.
It's interesting to me. I've never really had a big problem with that. I've just thought, well, look, the guy's got to run an economy, so he's running an economy. He's got to run a colony effectively, so that's what he's doing. The thing that falls apart for me is the denouement, because Kane's been hanging around for 3,000 years. Now, he has to have been running around for 3,000 years because we need his planet's star to go supernova and wipe out his planet. So, that has to happen. It needs to be a long time frame. The problem is that the dragon is couple of hours walk away from his headquarters and can be taken out with a couple of bazookoids. So the fact it took him 3,000 years to find the dragon and get someone to take it out for him is just absolutely ludicrous. But it has to be 3,000 years because otherwise you can't have the denouement. So they're trying to do it. And look, this is one of those things, and this is something that Rich and I talk about on Spacefall, was this plot designed for two sad blokes in their 40s to go and look at really, really closely 36 years later? No, it's not. In the moment, I'm sure all the audience would have gone, oh, wow, that's an interesting twist. I like that. That works. And not sit there and go, so it took him 3,000 years to find the dragon he found in 2 hours today? They're not going to see it. So, I mean, that's a looking back fault.
Yeah, there are still faults, though, that I remember having at the time, and they just come back to me again now. Nitro 9 being such a disappointment, for example. It's portrayed as really lethal, Dave, and we even have that line, it registers 9 on the Richter scale. And although that could be just amped up a bit for humour, when a couple of the cans of the stuff just make some sparks and knock away a door, but not even its door frame, it tends to make it look a bit weak and jokey in the wrong sort of way. And I remember even thinking that as a kid, they're not high explosives. I've just seen them work. They don't work as high explosives.
You're not wrong. You would have been 5 years older than I was when I saw this. I was 8. And for me, it was just, hey, she's got explosives. That's cool.
Right. Okay. I've made a note here too about killing all the shoppers who they've herd onto the Nosferatu and then blow it up. That's a very violent sort of thing to do. And it's a callback not dissimilar to what they do to the bus full of people in Delta and the Bannermen.
Yeah, I had the note here about that exact scene, and indeed exactly talking it back to the bus in Delta. In both cases, I could see Cartmel and the team going for a big, dark moment. And they are both big, dark moments. But in both cases, I don't think they're quite confident enough yet to really have them land. And they really sort of try and pull the punch. In the case of Delta, you get sort of, oh, wow, they've wiped out all the Navarinos. And then we kind of just quietly forget about that and move on. And in the case of the Nosferatu, there's that big moment. And Tony Selby plays it really, really well, that sense of just desperation and then just a lack of belief that this has happened. But then suddenly all the shoppers are back at the end.
That's a really good point. Maybe they were on other levels? Maybe.
Yeah, obviously it wasn't all the shoppers. It was just one spacecraft full. But again, if you're going to do this, Kane's just wiped out all the civilians. And then it's like, well, actually, no, all the shoppers are back. And, hey, shoppers, it's time for a new management at the end. They're doing I think what James here would call the pantomime walk-down ending. And I think it's Cartmel still trying to learn what he can get away with. And he'll quickly learn the BBC just doesn't care at this point. You can do whatever you like. They're not watching Doctor Who. So I think that Cartmel would have liked those moments to land even bigger, but you can really feel, again, the ship turning. And they're just trying to get a sense of how dark can we go here. We'll do these things, but we'll pull back a little.
Yeah. You've spoken about directors in the last few stories we've spoken about, and we I think we're contractually obligated, aren't we, to talk about that silly bloody scene of McCoy going over the railing at the end of the episode, seemingly to his death, when we're meant to see that there's a platform below him, which is what he's aiming for, but it's just so incredibly poorly done. It literally shows no platform below him at all. And it just makes no sense. And I remember watching it at the time as a kid in the lecture theatre at Sydney Uni, thinking, what on earth is going on? And I still have that exact same thought when I watch it today. It's so badly done.
It's funny, Rob. I'm a big fan of what Rob Shearman says about this on the documentary about cliffhangers in Doctor Who, where he says, as a kid, I thought that was absolutely terrible. It makes no sense. Then when I was a pretentious uni student, I thought, it's metatextual. It's really, really cool. Now I'm a bit older, I go, no, it makes no sense. And, and I think that's exactly right. Look, at the end of the day, I think it is a production mistake. There are two different long shots, one that's got the gantry in the side and one that doesn't, and neither of them match the point of view shot of McCoy looking down. So it is totally just a production flaw, which is a shame because I think it gets an unfortunate amount of attention for what it actually is. And I also think it's a shame because I think the direction's really tight on this. I think that Chris Clough had a reputation among fans by the end of the McCoy era for being the gritty action director, and I can see that here. And indeed, I actually really like most of the style of this story. I think the music is spectacular. I've spoken many times before about Dominic Glynn being one of my absolute favourite musical writers for Doctor Who, and I think his score here is wonderful. The little ice motifs, the big spectacular scores for the shots of Iceworld, the darker music, the sort of the really reflective music when Kane's tempting Ace, which is a wonderful scene, really well directed. I think that the model shot of Svartos and Iceworld is fantastic. I think that a lot of the design is really cool. I like the way the ice caves get darker as you go in. The way they imagine the ice gardens and the singing trees is really clever. I think the dragon, for a Doctor Who budget, looks really cool, and they're desperately trying to make it look a little bit not like a man in a rubber costume. Yes, it's a man in a rubber costume with a very big head on, but at least they're trying to do something different. I think there's so much in the production that I really, really love.
Wow.
Rob, a few other things I think we're contractually obliged to talk about. One is the McCoy distracting the guard scene. That, to me, has got better and better as I've got older and older, and I understand it. But I think what a lot of people miss for that is the punchline, which, having had this discussion about metaphysics with the guard, a couple of scenes later, the Doctor goes into the Nosferatu. He's encountered Belaz, who says, "Why are you here?" That's a very powerful question. Why is everybody so interested in metaphysics? Yeah. To which Glitz replies, "Doctor, I think she's going to kill us." An existentialist. Yeah. That's the punchline. And it's a fantastic punchline, and I absolutely love it. But it then goes into probably my favourite scene of the story, which is the Doctor confronting both Glitz and Belage. And this is where you really see, for me, the McCoy Cartmel Doctor has arrived. That moment of, Glitz, you pay back the debt, and Belage, you can never repay back your debt, ever. That still gives me chills, and for me, that's the moment I go, the Seventh Doctor is here. So I really, really love that scene. I think Kane is the best villain of the season, and it's not even close.
That's fair.
The Melting Face won the Best Special Effect Award in the local fan poll, and I think it still holds up really well. And when you compare it to the Melting Faces in Indiana Jones, which would have been done with, a couple of $1 million, and this was done with, £20, it holds up really, really well. Sophie Aldred, any comments about her, Rob?
Yeah, I mean, I mentioned at the start of this that this is the one where she comes in, and I think she's just really good from the start. She's just different and interesting. And we've had Mel, we haven't mentioned Mel screaming through all these stories, but Mel has been a screamer through all these stories, and it's just not something that Ace does, and instantly you have that difference, and you can see it on screen because they're on screen together. You can see the difference, and this more, I know it's cliche, but this more streetwise, younger type that seems less children's TV presenter and more realistic, even though she's not entirely realistic for what teenage girls were like back in 1987, 88. I like her. And she really grew on me a lot.
Yeah, I was actually going to talk about Mel in the summary, but I'll do it now as you bring it up. I don't have a problem with Mel in this. I think Bonnie gives a mostly pretty good performance, but I think all of Bonnie's best work is away from the Doctor. When she's away from the Doctor and working with Delta, for example, in Delta and the Bannermen, I think she's really good. When she's paired with Peck, she's really good. And here, when she's paired with Sophie Aldred, she's really good. And I think that this just is something, and we talked about this a few years ago, Rob, about companions that start with one Doctor and transition to another. Mel is designed for Colin's Doctor. And she works really, really well off that big Doctor. I don't think she quite works with McCoy's Doctor, but she's still very good away from him. I think that Sophie Aldred is clearly designed to work with the Seventh Doctor. Ace is designed to work with the Seventh Doctor. She's there for the vision that Cartmel has. And I think this is a really strong opening performance. In fact, I think it's one of Sophie Aldred's best performance in the show. But I did look at her in her first scene, particularly in that wonderful confrontation with Kane, which was the first thing that Sophie filmed. And again, I was going, wow, she's so young. I totally believe she's 16 in that.
Yeah, even though she's, about 26 or 27, something like that?
Maybe not quite that old, but definitely she's playing younger, absolutely, yeah.
Yeah, no, she's good. I like the bit where Mel is like, let's play I Spy. And there's this look on Sophie's face, like, oh no. You can just see the difference in the characters of Mel and Ace right there. Yeah, no,
I think you can, but as you mentioned earlier, that sort of writer's school writer sensibility of we're going to do something really clever, we're going to make some allusions to the Wizard of Oz, and just in case they don't get it, we're going to call her Dorothy. You just go, wow, that must have seemed very smart to you as a 26-year-old, graduate writer. It's not that clever, and it's not subtle at all.
Subtle as a sledgehammer.
Yeah, but it just totally sums up, where that is. And again, I would have no doubt that if Ian Briggs, who also went on to write Curse of Fenric, and he's a great writer, if Briggs and Cartmel were to do another draft of this again, I think that would be stuff they would absolutely rip out and do differently now.
Yeah, agreed.
Rob, I've spoken very enthusiastically about Dragonfire. It is my favourite of the season, and I'm giving it an A-. I know this is controversial. I know that fan wisdom is now, well, we used to say it was the best one, but now we see the faults and we see the benefit in others, and it's drifted down. It doesn't do well in polls these days. I don't care. It's my favourite. I loved watching this. It's the highlight of the season. For me, it's where the McCoy, Doctor, and Era and Companion all lands and sets us up for 2 really strong seasons to come. A- for me.
7 out of 10 for me.
That's better than I thought I was going to get for it out of you.
Really?
So that's equal first with Delta.
It is, yeah.
Okay, look, that's interesting. So I had Dragonfire a clear first, Paradise Towers a good second, Delta a worthy third, and Time on the Rani last. It doesn't work. And for me, I think that's a really good summation of the story. There's lots of things I loved. There's lots of ideas I love. There's some production decisions that are fantastic, and it does set up the McCoy era we all look back on now and respect. But along the way, there's some terrible decisions, there's some terrible performances, there's some narrative that just doesn't quite work. It is a weaker season of Doctor Who. I don't think it's the worst season of Doctor Who. I don't even think it's the worst season of classic Doctor Who. But it is down that end. But the fact that John Nathan Turner put 4 stories on screen is a miracle. The fact that I find 3 of them pretty watchable and a couple of them really enjoyable, and all of them, trying to be intelligent and smart, is just nothing short of miraculous. So, well done to them. This is an interesting season.
Yeah. I think it's the sum of its parts, at least.
Yeah.
Cartmel was given a bad hand for that first story, but he got some interesting guys in to write the rest. I think what they wrote is variable. It doesn't hold together in some ways. They'd make for much better comic books, as I've hammered quite a few times here. But it's that first step in getting to season 25 and 26. You can see the progression. And once we get there, we have stories in the same vein. They're just more polished.
Yeah, absolutely. The next story that Ian Briggs writes is a classic. The next story that Stephen Wyatt writes is better. McCoy's performance gets better from here. The direction gets better from here. Everybody gets better from here. Yeah.
So season 24 for mine is a prototype for McCoy. It's not like, look, the McCoy era emerged into the light, fully formed, but more, the McCoy era emerged with some rough edges and some work to do. But you can absolutely see the trajectory, and it doesn't need to take any violent U-turns in the second and third seasons to get where it's going. Again, I even see the Dark Doctor appearing in this season. So
absolutely.
Even that's not something that's invented later on. I don't think this season is as bad as its reputation has it by a long shot.
I agree. And for a season of 4 stories and 14 episodes, Rob, we have spoken a lot.
We have spoken a lot. And now it's our listeners' turn to speak a lot. And first up, I've got some audio here from Peter Cavanagh. He was very appreciative of your tip, Dave, to watch The Crusade on the Blu-ray set. Should we play this audio?
Oh, please.
Hi, Rob and Dave. Just wanted to say thank you for your review of The Crusade. At the end of the review, one of you says something like, oh, if you did have the Blu-ray and you skipped that, maybe go back. And so I did. I had watched the Blu-ray and I had skipped it. But I went back and I thoroughly enjoyed The Crusade. I think it was wonderful. And all the things you said in your review, the dialogue, the performances, William Hartnell, superb. But so just say thank you. I really have enjoyed it.
Thank you, Peter, for sending that in. That is a lovely comment to hear. The thing that I enjoy most about doing this podcast and being involved in Doctor Who fandom, full stop, is when fans discover a part of Doctor Who they didn't know about before and enjoy it. I love hearing when you say, I'd never seen The Crusade before and I've just watched it on your recommendation and I loved it. We had friend of the podcast, Phil from Sons of Audio, who messaged us to say, I'd never read Who Killed Kennedy before you guys did it as an episode, and that was a bloody enjoyable book and I loved it. That's fantastic. It's why I love podcasts like Too Hot for TV, where you go, I've never heard of this little bit of Doctor Who that exists before. I'm now going to check it out and it's really enjoyable. And I often think, how lucky are we as fans of a show that there is so much out there. There are the books and the audios and the comics and the magazines and the fan-made stories and just so much stuff. Jigsaw puzzles. Mm. We've got so much to enjoy. So that message is why I do the podcast. That is awesome.
Yeah, you'll never consume it all. That's the great thing.
It is. To another Peter Deadman has written in via email. Hi, Rob and Dave. Some great content recently I wanted to discuss. First of all, The Lord of the Rings is my Star Wars, though I like that a lot too. Fellowship came out when I was 16, and it left an indelible impact on me for years to come. I consider it, with a little nostalgia, to be close to being the perfect movie. Of course, I'd read, and especially listened to the 1980s radio play version, The Lord of the Rings, as a kid, so this brought it to life for me. I think you were right when you said that it was that key moment when practical was still being used with CGI to enhance and add background figures. It's for that reason that I feel The Hobbit actually looked a little worse despite coming out 10 years later. However, I can also understand Dave's confusion. My sister, who is not a fantasy fan at all, was entirely lost with what was going on, as well as the names and lore. I think it works as a total newbie, but it helps to have some idea of what's going on first. On your list makers on historical eras you'd like explored, there's a couple I'd like to see. Cleopatra and Mark Antony's final end would make a cool story, especially as a straight historical, but you could put in alien shenanigans if you wanted. Totally agree with that one. Mm-hmm. The Princes in the Tower was covered by a very interesting Big Finish story, but is also a great mystery setting for the Doctor to explore. I didn't know that, and as somebody who's doing a online Oxford course on the Wars of the Roses right now, I want to find out the title of that and listen to it. So, Peter, when you get this, message us or tweet us the title.
Nice.
The Tunguska event in Siberia would be perfect fodder for a Doctor Who story in the modern era. Easy to make it a spaceship or alien weapon crashing to Earth. I think that Trek did that somewhere. I think there's a whole thing about like the Vulcans intercepted and made it hit Siberia rather than Europe or something like this. I'm sure I've read that somewhere.
Right. It was certainly a big X-Files thing.
Oh, was it? Oh, there you go.
Yeah.
Finally, I'm disappointed that Season 3 of New Who didn't get up, as that's probably my favourite of all the new series, though I know Season 1 and 10 might be better. I also think Martha is my favourite companion of the new era too, though Bill comes close. I agree with you there, Peter. Mm-hmm. Season 24, though, is not without some interesting stories. Sadly, Time in the Rani is pretty cringeworthy due to incredibly hammy acting and a poor script. I think you'll agree with that conversation there, Peter.
Yep.
The 3 other series are certainly better and quite inventive. Dragonfire especially stuck in my mind, as Kane's melting death is up there with Raiders of the Lost Ark for horrific images in the young mind. Anyway, that's all for now. Keep up the good work, guys. Peter.
Lovely stuff, Peter. I really enjoyed that. Commenting on quite a few of our episodes, from the list makers through to the Lord of the Rings piece we did, and now tonight's episodes. That's just great. I'm going to read Constable Hansy via YouTube talking about our Fellowship of the Rings episode, which we didn't actually put on YouTube, but there is a video up there mentioning that we made it, and he has listened to it on the podcast app. Constable Hansy says, I enjoyed this immensely. It's unsettling to think how old these films are now. Thankfully, they still stand up as the masterpieces they are. Every couple of years, I'll happily sit down and watch all 3 extended versions and enjoy every second. Is Fellowship the best of the 3? It's either that or Return of the King. I'm a sucker for journey stories. See also Watership Down and The Keys of Marinus, among others. The Fellowship itself is a delight, with a wonderful motley crew. My only niggle is making Gimli a bit of a comic character. Book Gimli was a dignified, proud dwarf, and the sarcastic dwarf-throwing Jackson version didn't quite hit the mark for me. I'm currently watching Rings of Power. It's not bad, not great. I don't see why certain critics are being so harsh on it, but the one thing it does for me is underline just how wonderful those original 3 Jackson films are. Shame his magic touch didn't stretch to the Hobbit films. Loved the Meet the Feebles mention. I've never met anyone else who has seen that. It's been a long time since I watched it. Vivid memories of the heroin-addicted bunny and the media fly that always seemed to be sitting on a turd. Think I'll have to get myself a copy.
Yes,
anyway.
boss.
Anyway, looking forward to hearing how Dave gets on with the other films. Good stuff, gents. Take care.
Thank you. I'm glad you enjoyed that. I will watch The Two Towers maybe this weekend, depending on how I get on. The problem is that I'm not having to go. Like, they are 3 hours and change, so you sort of have to knock off an afternoon or an evening, and that's not always possible. I have an email here from regular correspondent Neelers C. Good to hear from you again, Neelers. Good evening, gents. Hope you're both keeping well. So I was in the gym a few times last week and decided for each session I was going to dive into your archives from before I discovered your show in 2021. First up, Keeper of Traken. Vastly underrated story from a vastly underrated series. I like this somber Fourth Doctor, and it's a beautifully set story with a classic villain and even more classic ending cliffhanger, which leads neatly into Legopolis. Agree with all of that there, Neilers?
Yeah.
Next, Season 16. Very hit and miss for me. I love The Pirate Planet. I think it's witty, funny, and, well, just all-round fun. The Power of Kroll is another I've always liked. The rest of the season I'm not overly fussed on. I can take it or leave it. I've always been of the opinion that Mary Tam's take on Ramanda appeals to me more. I think she's superb. Not saying Lalla Ward's isn't, but I've always preferred the chemistry between Romana 1 and the Doctor, especially in The Pirate Planet. Looking forward to the next episode. P.S. I couldn't believe Dave had never watched The Lord of the Rings. Cardinal sin that. Enjoyed the show about Fellowship of the Rings and actually forwarded it to a few friends that are big fans of that world. Looking forward to the Two Towers. Cheers, guys. Neelers.
Nice. Well, Dave, it's all on you now to be watching this next Lord of the Rings film, it looks like.
It is, because I had some feedback from a couple of friends who don't listen to the podcast, but they said, I did check out your Lord of the Rings one. So,
really?
Yeah, so there you go.
Okay. Finally, Constable Hansy has returned via YouTube to talk about our list makers on the Doctor overthrowing governments. And Constable Hansy says, that was a hard one. I think you guys definitely picked the top stories. I struggled to think of many others. Time Lash, maybe, if we assume the Borad is the government. The Crotons, again, assuming crystalline beasties are the government. Trying to think of a third Doctor example. He seems to be an obvious one with his disdain of bureaucracy, but my mind's gone blank. I guess Day of the Daleks could be a contender. The Mutants? Anyway, regardless, you both picked out the best choices. The one thing I came away with wishing is that someone would find The Savages. I'm convinced that it would leap up in popularity if we could sit and watch it.
Thank you for that comment, Constable. Look, I think Time Lash is a really good pull, and I almost regret not making not having that in my list. I think the problem with the third Doctor trying to overtake the government stories is most of the time he's stuck on Earth working for the government. So it doesn't work. But look, the mutants is probably the key one there.
Yeah. Moving along to what we've been watching. I haven't been watching much this past month, Dave, aside from season 24 and doing a whole bunch of other things. But inspired by the fact I've been listening to the Listen Very Carefully podcast, which is an Allo Allo podcast, I've been watching Allo Allo season 5, which many people will know is the long season of Allo Allo. Basically, most Allo Allo seasons are 6 or 7 episodes each. But season 5 is 26 episodes long.
Wow.
It's insane. They're actually 25 minutes instead of 30 minutes, which like the earlier seasons were. But still, they were trying to crack the American market and they were like, let's just do a 26 episode season. It's crazy. It is the season I remember being on TV here around 89-ish, so it probably played alongside Blackadder or something like that. I get a lot of warm fuzzies watching it. The wordplay is still really clever at this point, although it has reached the point in the series where the story is starting to go in circles a bit. Characters trot out their catchphrases a bit too often when there's no joke to be made, you know. It's getting to that point, but I'd still say it's in its imperial phase at this point, so I'm still enjoying that, and that's been the big thing I've been watching this month.
Oh, that's very cool. I'm still sticking with Agatha all along, and I'm really enjoying that. It's up there as easily one of the top 3 of the MCU TV shows that's been made, and frankly one of the only 3 good shows that have come out of the MCU. I will talk more about it when it's finished next month, because there's still a couple of episodes to go. But I will say during this month there was one big sort of mid-season revelation that I'd come back, I'd been out to dinner, so I wasn't drunk, but had a couple of drinks, and I was sort of, right, I'm just going to lie down on the couch and put on Agatha all alone. I'm watching, this is pretty good. And then the revelation came, and it was a proper, bolt upright, oh my God, wow moment. And then I messaged some friends, and they're like, have you seen it yet? Well, I was going, yeah, I sat up and bolted up, oh my God. They're like, yeah, me too. So, so that was really good, and the follow-up to that's been really good. This has been getting some really good word of mouth. Friends of mine who I know have been down on some other MCU shows, like myself, the tomato meter and the popcorn meter and comments on Twitter all seem to be pretty positive, which I think reinforces what you said last month, Rob, that no, people don't just hate on all new Disney shows or all new MCU shows just because they are, or all new Star Wars shows just because they are. When they land good, fans are willing to enjoy them, and I think that is the case here.
Yeah, absolutely.
I did watch all of Heartstopper Season 3. Look, it was quite good. Look, I think I prefer the Dylan Reese produced era. He's the Verity Lambert of Heartstopper for me. But look, Heartstopper, I don't think Season 3 was as good as Seasons 1 and 2. It was still very enjoyable. It was certainly very well made. And the plot story of the first half was very powerful, extremely well written, extremely well done. And I give it a lot of credit for that. But it wasn't quite as nice to watch as the first 2, perhaps. And I get it, and I get why, and it's a decision, and it's a good one, but it wasn't quite that feel-good, warm, fuzzy feeling that I got from the first 2. And I think they've also really reduced the cast a lot, and it was a lot of the sort of the extra cast. It was people like Ben and Harry and others like that I really enjoyed, James, that I really enjoyed in the first couple of seasons, and they're not in it this time. It's a much tighter season, and that to me made it a little bit more samey. So look, as a kid, do I wish we had anything like Heartstopper when I was a teenager? Bloody hell I do. It's wonderful television to have. It's still very, very good, but Season 3 didn't land as good for me as it did as the first 2.
Okay. Oh, that's a shame to hear, but good that it's still giving you something.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. Next time, Dave, we've decided on a topic that's been on the list for such a long time. It's one that you originally came up with. Do you want to briefly tell the listeners what we'll be doing?
So every year or two, we talk about a writer of Doctor Who and their work. We started with Terry Nation, because I love Terry Nation. Yeah. Our most recent one was Mark Gatiss, because he's such a controversial,
Marmite.
Marmite, yeah. As I said, everybody has their 3 favourite and least favourite Gatiss. No one's listed the same. So we did that episode a bit over a year ago now. But it became so obvious when we were looking at who are people who've written a few episodes, not so many we can't do them, not so few, it'd be too short an episode, but they've got some good stuff. And I thought, it's time for Rob and Dave to do Bob and Dave.
Yeah, that's cute.
So as of next month, Rob, you will be Bob.
Yes.
I will be Dave, and we will be doing a episode talking all about Bob Baker and Dave Martin.
Yeah, looking forward to that. There's some great stories in there.
There's some great stories in there. There's some terrible stories in there. And I suspect, once again, probably most people's worst Bob Baker and Dave Martin story is probably at least a plurality, if not a majority on that. But everybody's favourite, I suspect, will be very, very different. And I think there's a bit to talk about there. So, Bob and Dave do Bob and Dave next month.
I love it.
But we've been talking a long time. Listeners, hopefully you've stuck with us. Hopefully you enjoyed our talk about season 24, because there's just so much to talk about with that season, and hopefully you appreciated it.
Yeah, thank you very much for listening, and until next time, I've been Rob.
And I've been Dave.
This is the Doctor Who Show. Goodbye.
Goodbye.
You've been listening to
The Doctor Who Show with Rob and Dave.
Find us online by searching for
The Doctor Who Show.
We also love it when you write in. Drop us a line anytime at hello@thedwshow.net.